Hey everybody, it's your friend Adam. I'm here with Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. We are going to talk about objective morality, subjective morality. We're going to watch a couple of videos. Well, we might not get to both videos. We're going to at least watch one video of Cosmic Skeptic, part one of morality can't be objective even if God exists. Now, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. Michael Jones is a evolutionary. What? I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself. What's your background?
I'm a Christian, but I'm also a theistic evolutionist.
Right. That's what I was looking for. So, and I recently, I think the best description of my own beliefs are ethical naturalist. Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah, I would be an ethical non-naturalist then, more often called a non-natural moral realism. So you would be a natural moral realist, I'd be a non-natural moral realist. But yeah, ethical naturalist is a good term as well.
So let us know in the chat if the audio is okay. I do have a new overlay that I put together for this. That is one of my paintings, so you guys can let me know if you love it or hate it. And before we get into the video, I want a lot of these talks about objective morality and subjective morality, I think hinge a lot on the definition of objective and subjective. I think a lot of people don't necessarily have a clean understanding of objective or subjective. So do you want to weigh in on what you're thinking of for objective?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. So I would probably use just Andrew Fisher's definition. And philosophers don't really use objective morality, that term, a lot because it tends to carry different meanings. They use the term moral realism. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about morality, we're talking about it in terms of realism. So he says realism holds that moral judgments can be true or false, that sometimes they are true, and what makes them true is independent from people's or groups of people's beliefs, judgments, or desires. So that would be what objective morality would be. Now, the subjective morality would be basically it's relative to a specific group of people or person. So you could say if you're a moral subjectivist, you tend to be the idea of an individual relativist, that morality varies between person to person. There is no objective standard. It's just whatever the personal preferences are. Think of like ice cream flavors. Everyone's got their own personal preference for ice cream flavor. So that's what a moral subjectivist kind of is. Or sometimes you'll hear of like a cultural relativist, that morality is relative to each culture. So that might just be a general idea of what the terms mean and when you get into the philosophical views of it all.
Now, I think Cosmic Skeptic defines himself as a moral subjectivist as opposed to a moral relativist. So
yeah, that would be an individual relativist, or you'd be an agent relativist is technically the term for it. Of course, relativism and subjectivism are kind of thrown around a lot. If you get into the philosophical literature, what you tend to see is when they speak of relativists, they refer to a cultural relativist. And if you hear subjectivist, they tend to refer to an agent relativist or a moral subjectivist. Moral subjectivism just tends to, most of the time, refer to just an agent relativist.
So on the objective subjective, just to tie it down, I came up with some examples. So makes of automobiles, are these objective or subjective?
Preferences, they'd be
no. The actual make of an automobile. If I drive a Chevy, for instance, or a Ford, is the make of that automobile objective or subjective?
Oh yeah, that's objective.
Objective, easily, right? Denominations of currency, objective, right? A $5 bill is a $5 bill. Here's where we get into a little bit of a grayer area. The value of gold at any given time. It's objective, right? It's a value, but it's still objective. We can go to a website and we can say this is the value of gold, the exchange rate of gold in this particular place at this particular time, right? That's an objective.
Right.
Okay. Now, subjective, we're talking about like the quality of art, right? Totally subjective.
Yeah, I use taste preferences all the time.
So sure. The overall cultural impact of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, objective or subjective?
I mean, it's obviously a very strong impact if you get on YouTube at all. There's like all these
How
videos
strong
about
is
secret
strong?
filming. Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so many weird videos out there by fans. Whew. And I've watched too many of them.
The cuteness of puppies.
Oh, that's objective. They're very cute.
Okay. I agree with you, but I'm still going to throw my lot in with the subjectivists on the cuteness of puppies.
No one's perfect.
Hey, I think I'm getting a little background noise on you. I don't know if it's from your. I don't know if it's.
Well, it would be weird because I have headphones in, so that I don't hear anything coming out of the computer.
Let us know if you can hear any background noise. I think it went away. So okay, we're good.
Okay.
So let's so objective, when I think of objective, I'm thinking of an agreed upon measurement for things. So like in the value of gold at any given time, we are going to agree upon a measurement. Like we're going to go to this website, we're going to look up the exchange rate, and this is what we're going to agree upon as a measurement. Like buildings, we're like the height of a building, we're agreeing upon a measurement to measure this building, correct? That's what makes it objective.
I don't know if I would agree measurement is always, I mean, measurement is obviously one of the ways we could, but I mean, think of like mathematics. It would not be, mathematics is objective, but it's not something we measure. It's something, it's like abstract formulas that we would conduct. Yep. So I don't know if I would agree that it's always measurement, but that's one way to look at it.
But I think part of it is that we're agreeing upon some format to measure the natural world, right? I mean, that's what makes something that's what makes it independent of our subjective opinion. Without an agreed upon measurement, do we really have any way to call it objective?
It would depend, I'm getting philosophical here, but it would depend on what you mean by measurement. Right. So I mean, maybe if you're using it in a very general, broad sense, yeah, I could probably accept that. But it's we're just being very general when we use that term.
Right, but so like the height of a building could be subjective. If I say that it's tall and you're like, well, that's not very tall. That's, height is relative. If we're just saying tall or short, I mean, even the cultural impact of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we said, it's got to be. You said high, and I said, well, high. How high is high? Like, I mean, are we talking, Christianity level high? Are we talking Christmas level high? I'm not sure that the cultural impact is equal to Christmas. So
right,
but those things
I
are subjective.
What you're saying there.
Yeah, but if we agree upon a measurement, if we say like, well, compared to the cultural impact of this other movie that only made a certain amount of money, and the Marvel movies made, like, I don't know, what are they up to, like 10 billion? We might be able to come to some agreement on the measurement of the cultural impact by the amount of money the movie made. Like I'm saying that's a possibility, and not necessarily that would be the case. So.
Yeah, I mean, if we're using it in a very general sense, I would agree then.
Okay, cool. So do you want to dive into the video and take a look? You can.
Yeah. So you said that like you wanted to go over, like the last time we talked, you mentioned that because this is the video that the people got Cosmic Skeptic and I to have a debate on.
Go ahead and give the background that you were giving me beforehand, just so the audience can know.
Yeah. So he uploaded this video and a lot of my fans saw it and said, you should debate him because there's a lot of problems in this video. And I agree. There's a lot of bad ways things are defined. Like there's no such thing as atheistic morality or religious morality. That doesn't really capture. So people asked me to debate him. And then when I had you on your channel, or when you had me on your channel last time, you mentioned there were some things in here you wanted to go over because there were it seems like you were on a different page than him and I were on.
Yeah, well, you and I both believe that there is an objective morality. I guess maybe we should talk about that a little bit before we begin, because I think when I first came to this conversation, I was a lot where Cosmic Skeptic is. Like I looked around the world and I saw all these different moralities out there, and I just thought, well, obviously morality is subjective because everyone has a different opinion on what morality actually is. And the people immediately called me a moral relativist, and I didn't like that, so I found another name for myself. It was moral subjectivist. That's kind of where Cosmic Skeptic came out, and moral relativist means any moral system is just fine, as long as you can't really judge any moral system. Any moral system is equally good by. Am I getting close here to moral relativism?
You're getting close to it, definitely.
Go ahead, give us your definition.
It's just kind of funny because you're saying like it's all relative. You just can't judge, and I'm like, well, that's an objective claim because
totally.
It's like I always find that because I've had moral relativists tell me that, and I'm always like, that's an objective claim you're making. But yeah, Cosmic Skeptic's video here is just, I mean, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on it because as you mentioned, last time there was some issues you saw, you want to go over it. So, I mean, I think you're kind of hitting at the point of what relativism is. It's just relative to a culture, a family, an individual, society, whatever that would be.
Well, I think a cultural subjectivist, and this is where I chose the name cultural subjectivist over cultural relativist, because a cultural relativist will say that all cultures are equal, regardless of what terrible things they engage in. And nobody wants to say that because they don't want someone to say, well, you're a Nazi. So they avoid the cultural relativist term, but cultural subjectivist allows people to say, okay, there's a lot of different moral frameworks. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but we can rank order them. So we're not taking the position that anyone's moral system is just fine. So my understanding of the theist side of the debate, they're saying that there is a morality out there that's kind of an aspirational morality, a best case morality that would be objective, even though we may not have discovered it yet. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, we would say there is some sort of normative ethical system that is objective.
Right.
Its meta-ethical status would be objective. That, we're trying to discover, we're trying to find out through our moral experience and our moral progress.
Right. So this is where a lot of the miscommunication comes in, I think, because you're saying, yes, there are all these moralities in the world that are very different, which gives us the idea that they're subjective. But at the same time, we could come to an agreement on which one of these moral systems was best if we had an agreed upon metric for measuring that. And that's kind of where I am, and that's why I brought up the measurement aspect, because if we can agree upon a measurement for morality, and this is kind of what the Sam Harrises of the world are trying to do, they're trying to say, let's measure by human well-being, right? And I know the theists have a problem with that because they say, well, that's a terrible measurement, and I agree. But there are objective measurements that we do measure morality by all the time. I think the happiness index is an attempt to measure the aspects of society quantifiably. I don't think it's a successful measurement or a good measurement per se, but it is an attempt at that aspirational morality that I think we're all working towards. So,
yeah, and there are different ways to look at it from that perspective. Yeah,
but Cosmic Skeptic is just going like he's kind of ignoring a lot of the whole purpose of morality. Like he's simplifying morality down to just one statement, and I don't necessarily know that you can do that because you're talking about a moral system that involves a lot of different players and societal institutions, all these different things. So
yeah, but we can get into that when we get into the video because there was a lot of problems I remember having with this when I watched it originally and still do.
Okay. Before we start, I just want to say I've got nothing against Cosmic Skeptic. He's a great YouTuber. I like a lot of his stuff. So
yeah, he's a great guy. Yeah, I have nothing against him either.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex, and it's good to be back. If you're wondering where I've been, you can watch my latest live stream or the video called What Happened to This Channel. In the meantime, because of my absence, I don't feel like YouTube's algorithm will be on my side for a little while, so if you haven't already, be sure to hit the little notification bell next to the subscribe button down below, and follow me on Twitter, where I probably express more of my thoughts than even here on YouTube, so be sure to do that if you don't want to miss anything. Now, I'm sure you will know by now how much I love moral philosophy, and you probably know that I disagree with many of my atheist colleagues, colleagues like Stephen, Rationality Rules, or Matt Dillahunty, or people like Sam Harris, who say that morality can be and is objective. I don't think it's possible to prove in any objective sense that a person should or shouldn't act in a particular way. I don't think this can be demonstrated. And though
Now you disagree with that right off the bat, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't understand. Of course, it can't be demonstrated. It may be in the way he's using it, like you cannot, because he mentions this later in the video, like you can't prove this. And I'm like, yeah, we can't prove it, but you also can't prove moral subjectivism. That's the problem with ethics. It's not a science, or it's not a system of mathematics where you derive a proof. It's about what is the most probable, or what is the best explanation of the ethical reality that we have.
Right.
So yeah, I understand we can't demonstrate it, but it's never been about that.
Well, it really depends upon what your goal is. I mean, I mean, dependent upon the goal, you can demonstrate if certain behaviors are going to move you closer to that goal or further away from that goal. And that can also be demonstrated on a societal level. Like I said, there are all kinds of metrics that we're using to try to demonstrate the direction of society all the time. The happiness index, the suicide rate, the crime rate, like all of these things are metrics for determining how well society is doing. So,
right. And we use a lot of those metrics to make inferences to if morality is good in this area or that area. And
sure,
that's what
exactly.
kind of Thomas Nagel is. That's what, like, atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel hints at when he talks about morality.
Right. You're an empiricist, right? I mean, most of your stuff is. No, you're not an empiricist?
Well, I would be a rationalist. I mean, but rationalists are not against empiricism. We obviously use it. We just say that not all knowledge is empirical. There are rational truths out there. So, that's a whole nother subject.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you're going after Aaron Raw and Dillahunty all the time for not using evidence. And every time I think of evidence, I think of empiricism. So.
Oh, but that doesn't mean rationalists are against that. We all use such things.
Okay.
Though I've discussed this before, I haven't fully spelled out why I think this way. One important factor has always been my atheism. Previously, one of the premises of my argument that objective morality can't exist was the assumption of atheism. I used to think that the religious were the only ones who could legitimately lay claim to a worldview that does have some room for an objective understanding of morality. But as I've been thinking more about it, I've come to realize that even they, the religious, ultimately, as far as I can see, can't provide an objective basis for morality either. This might surprise you. It seems a given that if there really is a God, morality can easily be shown to be objective. But
I want to stop there for just a reason, because this is something it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, and I don't get that annoyed by it because I understand a lot of people don't know these terms. It seems when a lot of people talk about morality, they jump between moral ontology, meta-ethics, normative ethics, applied ethics, and they're not really differentiating it. Like right here, he's talking about grounding morality. Okay, that's moral ontology. But then he jumps right back and says that can be objective. Well, you can have objective morality without knowing how it's grounded, because you can have a good meta-ethical system that maybe you're a natural moral realist, or Kevin DeLapp. Kevin DeLapp is a philosopher. He's a natural moral realist. He says he doesn't know how to ground it, but he still thinks it's objective. So a lot of times this just kind of bothers me in videos like this. It's like they'll jump between these different views. You can have an objective moral. You can have a view where you hold objective morality, and yet you're not really sure how to ground it.
What do you mean by grounding?
The ontological grounding of such a thing. So, like, for example, the laws of logic are just simply grounded in reality. The laws of physics are grounded in the natural world. The laws of logic are objectively true, and then they are grounded in how reality operates. It would be how it is. So how something is grounded and if it's objective or not are two different things. Like, for example, you could be a moral subjectivist and still ground morality in like a God who's just his subjective opinions. Like, let's say you're a polytheist and you think that Zeus exists, and you just ground morality into the opinions of Zeus. Okay, well, you've grounded morality in something, but it's still subjective. So what is so the objective distinction is different than how you ground something.
That's fascinating. So would another way to say it be kind of the source of authority? Something is grounded. This
Yeah,
is what's giving it its source of authority.
right. That's a good way to look at it too. That would be a good way,
This is why we should believe it.
Right.
Okay.
And yeah, so he jumps between. This is one of the things that bothered me when I first watched this video, is that he jumps between these two things. And I've seen like other atheists like R and Raw do this too, is that they jump between normative ethics, meta ethics, moral ontology, applied ethics, and they don't realize they're not making these. They're jumping in between different fields of study, and we need to point that out, because just because even if theists are right that morality is grounded in God, that could still be subjective morality. There still needs to be a case made there.
Right. How would it be if it was grounded in God and there's only one God? How would it be subjective? How would it still be subjective?
Well,
Because of
let's just say that,
interpretation?
let's just say like something like open theism is true, and God is sort of like subject to time. Okay, well then he doesn't. If open theism is true, God doesn't know the future. He's subject to time and possibly space as well by that logic. Well, it's because he created humans. You could say that morality, we have to be beholden to our creator's morality, but he can change his mind. I guess you could say maybe 1,000 years ago he thought this, but now he's moved on to this, and so our morality needs to follow him. It's following the grounding of our creator, even though it's subjective.
Okay, so when you say subjective, are you using subjective just as a stand-in for changing over time? Because I think like the value of gold changes over time, but it's still, I would say, objective.
I would say that it's objective. Value of gold is objective to the time frame it's in, but the actual value of its gold, like it's not objectively, it's not objectively something that cannot. It's not something that is objective in the sense like 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Yeah, without human beings valuing that gold, the value.
Right.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of an emergent property.
Yeah, it is, and it's subjective, or it's relative to whatever humans decide it be, but it's not objective beyond that. And so there is some sort of subjectivity into there. Now, it is an objective fact that gold is valued at this rate at, say, like 1972, and it's objectively valued at this rate at like 1973. But it's not objectively, there's not some sort of objective value in the sense like 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Right. Yeah. It's a different level of objective.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, let's move on.
I honestly don't now think this to be the case, which marks a significant shift in my moral philosophy, since this closed what I previously considered to be the final possible gap in which objective morality could be said to exist. And with that gone, I now have the view that all morality, even religious morality, is ultimately subjective. And this makes objective morality impossible, as far as I'm concerned, even just in principle. And I can't overemphasize how important this is. This has massive philosophical implications, not least that it seems to lead logically to nihilism for many people, an incredibly uncomfortable philosophy and one that I'll be discussing very soon. But
I'm feeling some nihilism creeping in right now.
Yeah,
I'm teetering on the edge.
before I can have such discussions, I need to solidify my...
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I mean, there's 3 ways to look at moral properties. There's nihilism, emergentism, or irreductivism. Irreductivism is that moral values and duties simply are. Emergentism is the idea they emerge from other things, or nihilism is they just don't exist.
Right.
So, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily entail moral nihilism, because it could be some form of like emergentism.
So what is your take on the emergentism? Maybe I'm closest to that.
Well, I mean, a natural realist would be an emergent. You hold that they're like emergent from some sort of natural properties. Or non-cognitivists would be that, moral properties are non-cognitive, but they're sort of emergent from psychological states. So you could have, it doesn't really tell if it's, the properties themselves. This is where I go again about there's a difference between grounding or what the ontology of morality is versus if it's objective, subjective. Because you could be an emergentist and still be an subjectivist.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you could say morality is subjective. Or you could say that it is emergent. You can still be like, hold that it's objective, that it's sort of grounded in some sort of natural properties.
moral philosophy and explain it as precisely as I can to you. And so I've decided to make some videos doing exactly that. That means that there are a few things I need to cover. First, I need to explain what I mean by morality. Not just what is good and what is bad, but what is good and what is bad. Then I need to show why I think that morality is and has to be subjective. And this means I need to first show why religious morality is subjective, even if God does exist, and even if he really is the author of good and bad. And then I need to show why atheistic notions of objective morality, like Sam Harris's for instance, are also flawed and ultimately subjective too. The reason for covering both bases is to attempt to show that not only is morality subjective, but it has to be subjective, regardless of the existence or non-existence of God. Now, this first video will both outline how I define morality and explain why I think religious morality is subjective, and a subsequent video will explain why I think atheistic morality is subjective too. And then perhaps a further video will explore the implications that this all has, like the claim that it leads to nihilism, if that's something you'd want to see. And this is a big topic, and I'll be disagreeing with some big names and popular philosophies. Most of my friends and colleagues disagree with me here, so the likelihood is that there will be something in this video that you object to. If you do, then good. Let me know why. And if not, let me know if that means I've changed your mind in any way. So,
Do you want to define morality before he does?
No, I want him to do it, and then I want to point out why that's not really an adequate definition.
All right.
let's get going with this. First, I need to define what I actually mean by morality, and this isn't as simple as it seems. I saw a clip of Tracy Harris on the Atheist Experience recently arguing with someone, and she proposed what I think is a good way to understand what we mean when we say morality. She asked the caller to imagine that he was trying to determine whether or not a dog had moral tendencies. What would we look for in that dog or in the dog's psychology to determine whether or not it's a moral agent? This helps us pinpoint precisely what we mean by morality. Now, Tracy argued that we would look for a recognition of certain concepts like fairness and empathy, and if the dog recognizes fairness, for instance, and acts in a way to procure it, we can call it a moral agent. Now, I think Tracy's great, but I can't agree with this. Let me give you an example to explain why. Imagine we were to design a robot, and we programmed it to be selfless and bring about what we, the programmers, felt was fairness. As the robot goes about its business, fulfilling its programming and procuring fairness, could you call it a moral agent when it's just fulfilling the commands of its...
I just want to point out for my moral foundations theory fans in the chat that his morality is all about fairness and empathy, which is care harm. So typical liberal morality here, all limited to there's nothing about authority or loyalty or sanctity or anything like that. Yeah, it's all straight progressive morality. Yeah.
I see what you did there.
This programming? I don't think you could, even though it technically has a recognition of the concept of fairness. I think there's more to it than that. I think morality is twofold. First, it entails a recognition that some things are good and others are bad. And secondly, and this isn't the same thing, an intuition that we ought to do that which is good and ought not do that which is bad. I'll dive more into that soon, but the reason that I think we need this, more than just a recognition of concepts like fairness, to be encompassed into our definition, is because the reason I wouldn't call our robot a moral agent is because it has no recognition of good or bad or any concept of moral ought. It procures fairness because it's programmed to, not because it feels that it should. If it did have an experience of ought, we may well call it a moral agent. So that's why I define morality in this way. So I suppose I would define morality as the intuition that we ought to do that which is good and ought not to do that which is bad.
Okay, so his definition on the surface sounds good. It sounds like, yeah, that sounds like it is, until you really start to think about it, start to chew on it for a little while, because morality is not just duties, ought to do this, it's also values. So think of something like love. You could say love is objectively good, but that doesn't mean you ought to be in love. You could say friendship is objectively good. That doesn't mean you ought to all, befriend everyone. So the problem with this definition is not that it's bad, it's that it excludes half of what morality is, namely values. This is why if you read like Ruth Schaefer Landau, Nathan Nobis, Richard Brink, they would talk not so much about oughts, but more encompassing, they talk about moral judgments, that moral judgments, how we judge things, how we judge duties, how we judge values. So this is one of the main problems I had with this definition, that it's just incomplete.
Yeah, and I guess you would get to the subjective point of view if you're only limiting yourself to the intuition. I see morality as a set of rules that governs a group of people as they compete in the world for survival and resources. So like you have a set of rules that's governing your body right now, that's making up you as an organism. Each of your cells has to obey those certain rules. And when certain cells get selfish, we call that cancer. Like the selfish cells can destroy the entire body in the same way that the selfish humans can destroy the entire group. So really a lot of morality is to fight against that selfishness. So a lot of the problems that I have with Cosmic Skeptic's view of morality is just, it's so narrow. It's like that we ought to do what's good for who? For me or for the group? Because a lot of times where the conflict arises is I want to do what's good for me and screw the group. So,
yeah, it's also a kind of he's kind of giving a normative ethics, like a normative morality here, is his view of normative ethics. This is what we ought to do. It's almost deontic in how he's doing it. But I mean, there are other normative views. There's like, you could be utilitarian. Like morality is we ought to do what would bring the most happiness to the most amount of people. Or myself, who am a virtue ethicist, we would say we ought to do what would bring about virtues, or we ought to make our actions conform to what is virtuous. So it's a little bit different. So he kind of gives this like idea of morality and says, well, everyone would accept this. And I'm like, well, read a couple books on normative ethics. There's a lot of disagreement about that.
But when you're talking about virtue ethics, and I'm very much in line with a virtue ethic outlook. You're talking about the virtues that would foster what is good for both you and the community, right? Because there are people that could have virtues that were just about what's good for me. Like, and I think a lot of people intuitively don't view this as immoral. They intuitively view selfishness as immoral. I mean, some people obviously, like the Ayn Randians, they want to sanctify selfishness. They want selfishness to be the ultimate value.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that's a good moral system.
Right. Yeah. And that's a different system in and of itself. But yeah, you know, it's just you're right. It's just way too narrow in the way he's defining it.
Yeah, I don't know. And this is one of my problems that I had with this video, is Cosmic Skeptic is supposed to be representing the naturalist perspective. And there's so much research going on in there. You already mentioned Jonathan Haidt, Jordan Peterson's another one that is constantly talking about the evolutionary psychology. Like there's so much going on in this field.
Simon, in terms of like meta ethics, I mean, you could be like someone who's like Simon Blackburn, who's like a quasi realist, or it could be like Kevin DeLapp, who's a natural moral realist. I mean, this is not it's the naturalistic views of morality, or it's actually a wide variety. I mean, I've not even gotten into Cornell realists even. I mean, that's a whole other subject of itself.
I love that you know all this stuff. I've told Michael many times he's the one that taught me philosophy, because every time someone would snipe at me about philosophy, I'd have to look it up, and I would always find a video on the Inspiring Philosophy channel that would explain the point, and I'd think, oh, look at that. That's what they mean by moral relativism. Even have like the little chart showing where everything comes off of everything else.
Yeah, that's why I made the chart as it is. You can kind of see all the branches.
It's such a great resource.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah.
This definition is incredibly broad, of course, but with good reason. The reason is that it can encompass all popular notions of morality, and so we don't need to fall at the first hurdle. For instance, Sam Harris's notion that we ought to do that which brings about well-being, and thinking that well-being is good, is a belief that we ought to do that which is good.
See, this is the problem too, because and David Sloan Wilson kind of lays this out brilliantly. He says there are when you're interacting in groups, there's what's good for me and what's good for the community, but oftentimes those things are in conflict, and religious systems are developed to avoid that conflict. They give us a stylized world that gives us an outlook on how to behave when things get fuzzy, because obviously, inevitably, they do. You know, our genes might want us to cheat on our wives, but it might be better that we don't do this. So, you know, obviously, we elect a moral prohibition against adultery, which just makes things simple, right? Is you know that is always wrong, always wrong. But a lot of those moral prohibitions they're more geared towards keeping groups successful and viable over time, and putting aside our own selfish nature. If you don't take that into consideration, then you're talking about this stuff, and throughout this video, Cosmic Skeptic constantly talks about it, and I never know, are you talking about the good of the group, or are you talking about the good of the individual? And what do we do when those things come into conflict?
Yeah, I think he's not. It's not really. You know, he doesn't really give a specific view what he's arguing for. And I think before the debate I had with him, he mentioned he was a non-cognitivist, so that might be why. But he doesn't really specify that here, because he's talking about moral subjectivity, and a non-cognitivist really wouldn't call themselves a subjectivist or a relativist.
It fits our definition. Religious morality too fits into it, since the religious feel we ought to do that which God...
Yeah, they're saying in the chat that there's still a funny noise in the background. I don't know. I don't necessarily... I'm sorry, guys. I don't necessarily know what's causing that.
Yeah, I'm not hearing anything either.
You don't hear anything on your end? I hear, like, it sounds like someone's vacuuming in the background.
Yeah, I don't know.
You don't hear it?
I hear nothing. I don't know. I could try taking my headphones out. Maybe it'll go away.
I don't know.
No. So see, let me everyone know in the chat if that's better.
Test 1 2.
Because I wonder
if it's still coming back. So I don't know. I'll see if I can mute it on my end.
Okay. Yeah.
We'll defined as good. This is why I think this is the best definition.
Yeah, you got to put the headphones back in. We can hear a little feedback. Sorry.
Definition of morality to start with, because it's broad enough that we can all agree with it. But it's important to keep in mind that the definition is composed of two parts, the good and bad, and the ought and ought not. They're not the same thing, and we'll see why this is so important shortly. But now, of course, we run into the problem of defining what we mean by good, or bad, or ought, since we're using these words in our definition. You might say that these terms need themselves to be independently defined within our broader definition. But the reason I haven't done so is because I believe it's impossible to do so. You'll hopefully understand this by the end of the video, but my whole point here is that the reason morality can't be objective is precisely because good, bad, and ought can't be defined. I subscribe to G.E. Moore's notion that good is like the colour yellow. It has no synonyms. It can't be described to someone who's never experienced it. Nonetheless, you know what I mean by yellow. And you know what I mean by good. Even if you disagree when I call a particular thing good, the very fact that you can disagree demonstrates that you still know what I mean by good, even whilst disagreeing that that particular thing is good. For instance, Sam Harris might say, and has said, that throwing acid in the face of a girl is not good. If someone were to claim that doing so actually is good, they clearly have a wildly different moral philosophy, and yet to even be able to disagree, they must still know what Harris means by good. The moment we attempt to define good, as in to give it a synonym, we necessarily have to presume a particular moral philosophy. I might define good as what God commands, or as what procures well-being, but to do so I would automatically be agreeing with a certain philosophy. And this is...
What procures well-being for the girl, or what procures well-being for the group? That's where I'm constantly... What did this girl do?
Right, and this is also he's now going into normative ethics. So if he's arguing if morality can't be objective, it's odd that he would be talking about normative ethics now, because you can have a normative ethical system built on a subjective view or a non-cognitivist view or a a moral realist view. It's just a different subject. I mean, you don't have to, it's hard. I see this all the time. They're blending the different aspects of morality without realizing it.
This is why I haven't defined good, bad, or ought in my definition. Again, this should be more clear by the end of the video. So that's the definition of morality I'm working with. Morality is the conception that we ought to do that which is good and ought not do that which is bad. We can have a wealth of disagreement over whether or not a particular thing is good or bad, but we can still agree that if it is good, whatever that means, we ought to do it. And if it is bad, whatever that means, we ought not. You might think this definition is broad, but that doesn't make it wrong.
So he's just basically defining morality as the intuitions that we have. We codify those intuitions into law all the time. I mean, this is why we have laws against murder, because we all have this intuitive feeling that murdering people is wrong. So we just say, okay, we all agree on that. Let's make it a law. Nobody can do it. And then it becomes objective because, we agree upon it. It's like the value of gold.
Well, I wouldn't say that's when it becomes objective. I would say it was objective prior to that.
I would say it was objective prior to that too, in that it is a design principle that is a necessity. See, and this is where I think people come into conflict over this stuff. And Brett, I just watched a talk Justin Brierley had sent me a talk with Brett Weinstein and Alistair McGrath that's going to be coming out on the Unbelievable channel soon. I just did an interview with him. It should be out on Friday. And Brett says something in that talk that's so perfect. He says the idea, like all of these moral systems have come down to us through an evolutionary process. Now, you as a theist might have problems with that. You're an evolutionary theist, so you probably would have less problems with that. But he's saying that these ideas, these systems of behavior go together. And the idea that you could just arbitrarily put some system of behavior together is as crazy as the idea that you could just put some arbitrary grouping of genes together and come up with an organism. So there is a certain amount of design that needs to go into these in order for them to work. And I think that design you would have to call objective the same way that you would call a group of genes that make up a genome objective in the fact that it works. One way works, right. One way doesn't.
I would agree. Yeah, I would. My meta-ethical views are very similar to Thomas Nagel, and he's an atheist. So, I mean, we just disagree on the grounding aspect. But in terms of objectivity, I mean, I'm on the same page with him there. So, okay. Yeah, and I agree that, you could, him and I would just kind of argue we've evolved to learn these things. And like you were saying, we've evolved to learn what works best. Like with the gene things, you just can't put random genes together and expect it to work.
So am I pretty close to Thomas Nagel? Because it's funny, I've never read Thomas Nagel.
Well, I will send you some books if you want them, because if you read his book, Mind and Cosmos, you'll probably like that.
Okay, cool.
So this is perhaps the most surprising of the claims I'm making, that even if God exists, morality is still subjective. In fact, a popular argument employed by the religious to discount atheism is...
So I guess here is the big question. If some random person puts together an arbitrary moral system, and they say this is my moral system, but that moral system is as laughable in its ability to function in the world as some just random grouping of genes creating an organism, is that really a moral system? Can we call that a moral system?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if there's certain, sometimes I use the example of an airplane. Like there are certain ways you would design an airplane if you were designing it for speed. There are different ways you would design that airplane if you were designing it for efficiency for trafficking people. Those two different ways are in fact objective.
Right.
Morality is a lot is very similar to that. Like if you're designing a jet plane for speed and you decide, I like this design feature where we're going to put a 10,000-pound steel ball on the bottom of the plane, I would say that your design is not going to work. even though your subjective feeling that this design feature is just going to be awesome.
Yeah. There's an objective system of morality that is the most optimum, efficient way for humans to operate with.
Yes.
Like with your examples. Yeah. And that's what moral progress is about. That's what we're trying to figure out. The same with analogous to scientific progress. Just because different people disagree on different scientific theories doesn't mean there's some objective scientific view underneath it all that we're trying to discover.
Yeah, and this is kind of the problem. This came up in one of your debates when one of the people you were debating said science is subjective because it works on consensus. And I was thinking, like, okay, I understand, right? Like, you've got so many aeronautical engineers that are going to come to some consensus on this plane that we want to build the fastest plane ever built, right? And you might have a whole bunch of engineers that have all these different ideas towards design, but we don't always know if they've achieved the best design because there's always there's almost an infinite possibilities of ways that you could design a plane. Somebody comes up with something new and all of a sudden, a new propulsion system even, and all of a sudden, hey, we're that much faster.
Right. Ultimately, there are right and wrong ways, though, is what you're getting at, which is the point. And that's the same, it's analogous to how morality works.
Right. But if you don't understand, I think a lot of this goes back to just a bad definition of morality.
Yeah. And he's been called out on that. I know, forget who it was, but there was a philosopher who wrote a blog on this video and called him out. Really? A lot of people have called, I forget who it was. I think his name was Alex, but I cannot remember his last name. So I don't know, I have to look it up.
Precisely that atheism can't provide an objective basis for morality. Here's Dr. William Lane Craig admitting that one reason he believes in God is simply because he can't bring himself to think that the Holocaust wasn't objectively bad.
I'm convinced that there really are objective moral duties and values, that the Holocaust is not just something that is wrong relative to Western democratic standards, but right for the Nazis. So that if the Nazis had won World War II and everybody believed the Holocaust was good, on that atheistic view, then it really would have been good. That to me is morally unconscionable. I think that's just false.
Did you catch that? He thinks that it's morally unconscionable that morality is purely subjective, which makes him think that it's false. He also thinks that religion provides objective morality where atheism doesn't, and this...
That's not really what Craig is saying, to defend Craig there a little bit. He's not saying it's unconscionable, therefore it can't be, or it's got to be objective. He's arguing from his intuitive understandings that morality is objective. So I don't think Alex is really representing Craig here that well.
Yeah, my understanding would be that obviously the design principle is bad. Like killing off half your population, it's not really a good design principle for a moral system. I think I can objectively say that even as an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
Does this betray a value of comfort and convenience over a value of truth? Perhaps. Here's him doing it again.
Because it leads to a worldview which is, I think, unlivable. It's incapable of being lived consistently and happily. You cannot live consistently and happily as though moral values and duties are just the results of feelings and subjective impressions. You're going to want to say, for example, that apartheid was really wrong, that the killing fields of Cambodia were really wrong. And you can't do that if it's just based in feelings.
Now, putting aside the fact that Dr. Craig dismisses morality based solely on feelings because he feels it's uncomfortable.
That's not really what he's doing. He's arguing from moral intuition that the way morality manifests in reality, it manifests objectively. Like the way scientific theories manifest in reality, they're obviously either objectively true or objectively not true. Craig is not just saying, well, it feels bad, therefore it has to be objective. He's saying that the way morality operates, the way it actually manifests in reality, this appears to be objective. That's why we want to say apartheid is wrong, and that justice has to be done for those harmed by that because this was objectively wrong. It doesn't manifest like taste preferences do, where it could be where they are subjective and there is no justice that needs to be done if someone likes squid flavored ice cream.
Aren't there? Isn't some of it a preference type thing? Because if the moral intuitions are objective, like we can measure them. Moral foundations theory is all about measuring them. Jonathan Haidt has done experiments where he's measured them. So these intuitions are objective in the fact that we can measure them, but different people have different moral intuitions about things. But in order to establish some sort of agreement that a group is going to adopt, there's a lot of factors that are at play. One of the factors I would say is probably that the people's moral intuitions have to sync up. Like we all have very strong moral intuitions about killing and murder, but our intuitions about, as a group, our intuitions about things like abortion are conflicted. So I think your microphone is maxing out when you're not talking. I think you have some kind of preference on it. It's just picking up background noise in the room.
Let me try switching it to my headphones. Maybe that will help.
Yeah.
That's never happened before.
Yeah, I'm competing. It sounds like I'm competing against like a jet engine.
Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. I'll just unplug this mic. I don't know why that's acting up. Maybe I need to get a new one. Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's a million times better.
Okay, good.
Sorry. So do you understand what I'm saying about the intuitions? Even though I completely forgot what I was saying.
Yeah, I get what you're going at there. But yeah, we can move on if you want.
Yeah, let's do it.
This is a very common argument, and an effective one too. Dr. Craig is right that most people long for a way to objectively protect and justify their moral intuitions, and many find this in God. But if I can show that even with God, morality is still subjective, this argument crumbles. So why does Dr. Craig feel atheism can't provide a basis for objective?
You hear that? The argument crumbles. He just destroys it. Bam!
Morality.
Well, because if morality is just based in feelings and relationships with other people and the way we were raised, by our parents and society, then it's all relative. Someone who has different feelings or raised in a different society might have a vastly different set of values. And
if those intuitions, though, are biologically based, I don't know how different they can be society from society. Like we all the structure of our eyes are all pretty much the same from society to society. And those moral intuitions could be a lot like the structures of our eyes, because the structures of our eyes are just an excellent feature for the fact that there's visible light in our environment. Like they're useful. Moral intuitions can be useful in exactly the same way.
Yeah, that's something Kevin DeLapp tries to argue because he's a natural ethicist. So, he's trying to get to the same kind of ideas where there could be these similar structures that sort of are just similar across humans, and that's why it's all objective and the same for each person.
Right. So, but you're probably more familiar with now I can't even remember his name. Who's the guy talking right now?
That's William
Lane Craig. Yeah. So you're more familiar with him probably than I am. So he's making a case. He's probably making a strong case that morality has to have a God to be objective.
Here he's just talking about it being objective in and of itself, that it's just counterintuitive. It goes against the evidence that it is subjective. The evidence does not show that it's based in feelings, that it is not based in cultural preferences, because these ideas of morality don't adequately explain or capture what morality is. So non-cognitivism still cannot really ground morality and cannot really explain how morality is, the same. It's like these certain non-cognitive states, whether it's like your emotions or different prescriptions you may have, or there's different forms of non-cognitivism, and I don't really want to go in and explain them all now.
Yeah,
but,
don't do it.
But yeah, I don't think Cosmic Skeptic is really getting at what Craig is trying to say here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my question is that how attached are you to the moral argument for the existence of God? Is that one of your top arguments?
I think it's a sound argument. Yeah, I use it. I have 2 videos on it.
Right. Where is it in your hierarchy of of arguments?
I do use it. It's not my top argument.
Okay,
I'd
okay.
probably like do the physics argument, conscious argument, maybe the introspective. I mean, I leave it below or like contingency arguments because I think it's probably still up there.
Okay, I'm just curious. I think the moral argument is going out. I think scientifically we'll be able to explain morality in detail. Well,
that's where we disagree.
This is the problem that I have as an atheist, because I'm so conflicted here, because the power of religion is undeniable, but in order, you agree that our moral intuitions can be wrong, correct? I mean, otherwise we don't have the whole idea of moral progress.
Right. We could have certain intuitions that are wrong. I would need to know. It depends on what you mean by intuitions there. Could I have moral opinions that are wrong? Yeah. I could misunderstand the way morality is supposed to be in that type of sense. So, yeah.
Well, how do we know that our moral intuitions are wrong? I mean, we're testing them empirically, right? We're trying different things, and we're seeing different outcomes, right? Some of those things, some of those different ideas come from divine revelation, and in my opinion, as an atheist, that divine revelation could just be, psychologically motivated, but we're still out there trying new things through this process of trial and error. Some of those things work and some of them don't. Like Jordan Peterson famously talks about Peterson truth, and I know a lot of the anti-theists have given him a hard time, but what he is in effect saying is that we don't know if some behavioral attribute is going to be successful until we try it out. And it either works or it doesn't work. If it works, it's sort of codified in these biblical texts. It's codified in our traditions in a lot of different ways. And so we have this track record of success that we bring to the table along with our moral intuitions.
Yeah, and so that's, we start with like these moral intuitions we have that like rape is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And we then see, is it actually helping people? Is it benefiting them that we have this moral intuition that, we stop rape, that we punish rapists, that kind of idea. And so we don't, I always tell people intuition is our starting point. And when it comes to morality, the one way we look at it is through moral progress. Is this actually making humanity better off when we adjust our morality to move more in this direction? Similar to how scientific progress works. We also check these things via our moral experience. So, if we experience that, perhaps this certain intuition we have is actually causing more harm, then we abandon it. I could talk a lot about the different moral views of ancient cultures versus what, we have in the Pentateuch. There's actually some interesting differences there, because a lot of the ancient societies, the highest moral good was order, and the lowest moral good was disorder. So a prostitute, it would have been bad for this prostitute to leave her temple of like the temple of Ishtar, because that creates disorder. Even though she may be internally suffering, she doesn't want to be a prostitute. Some scholars like Jean Bottero, John Walton have argued that in the Pentateuch, it's turned on its head. It says that moral system isn't really working. It's better to reject prostitution, even if it's going to cause, disorder or chaos in society, because, that moral system, just trying to make sure everything is ordered properly, isn't really working. It's not really making humanity better off. So I'm using this as like an example to kind of explain what you were getting at. But yeah, that's kind of like what it was, is like the ancient Sumerians or the ancient Babylonians had this idea where we ought to prize order. The Hebrews come along with the Pentateuch and they go, no, we ought to prize, what actually is, these certain moral values and duties that we're going to prescribe and say that we ought to have. Like prostitution is just always wrong. You shouldn't have temple prostitutes. You shouldn't treat, lower members of the society worse off, even if that breaks the order. So that was kind of like, Jean Bottero talks about it as a revolution in a sense, and it fundamentally changed the way ancient people thought about ethics. And
he argues that it actually made society better in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I think today we still use that axis for order versus anarchy, because it seems like the left is the anarchist and the right is the order crowd.
So here's an interesting quote you might like from Botero. He says, "Did morality have an authentic religious and cultural value within this ancient Near Eastern culture?" He says, "I think not, because the ancient Mesopotamians never overtly concerned themselves with or imagined such preoccupations, which are so familiar to us today. This must have been one of Moses' greatest revolutions in Israel, to replace the purely material maintenance of the gods with a single and sole obligation in life to obey a moral law, thereby truly rendering to God the only homage worthy of him." So he argues that it basically revolutionized the way that people started to view morality, and it obviously made the world a much better place in terms of that.
Yeah, so they started viewing morality as an ordering mechanism.
Kind of.
Maybe rephrase what you say. I'm not sure I completely understood.
Well, they started viewing morality more about integrity, guilt, that we ought to care for the individual. This is why certain laws show up in the Pentateuch, like you have to love the foreigner like they're one of your own countrymen. You cannot sell your daughter into prostitution. Christine Hayes talks about how if you hit a slave, you have to let them go, even if it's as small as a tooth. It was a idiomatic expression to say, even if you damage them in the slightest way, you have to pay for that. So it was more focusing on nurturing individuals than just nurturing the order of society.
Oh, I got you. So the weighing the needs of the society against the needs of the actual individual. Before that, it was much more, society was more important. Yeah, no.
Right.
See, we're talking about design principles right here. We're talking about how do you get better outcomes. Yeah, unleashing the power of the individual gave us a lot more stuff.
Exactly.
A lot more discovery, a lot more technology, a lot more of everything. Yeah. We found a better way.
There's a lot of interesting things on the difference between like the Babylonian view of ethics versus what you get in the Pentateuch. It's actually quite fascinating.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
Moral duties, and therefore it's not objective, it's purely subjective.
Okay, so that's crucial.
Hey, I saw your super chat, Ozjar. We'll do super chats at the end.
Note the usage of the word therefore. Dr. Craig says that atheistic morality can vary depending on a person's upbringing, their geographical and social background, their environment, which therefore shows that it's subjective, because it wouldn't be variable if it were objective. So it seems by that logic that if I can show that religious morality can vary in the same way, it too is therefore subjective.
See, and he's doing exactly what I said about so you look out into the world and you see, there's a lot of different ways of structuring airplanes. Therefore, airplane designs are all subjective. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a bad argument.
There are all these different cars, all these different ways to make a car. So therefore, it's all subjective. I'm going to put my wheels on the top of the car.
And of course, a moment's reflection allows us to realize that religious views too, obviously, vary in exactly the same way. A person's religion is, more often than not, determined by their social and geographical background, just as atheistic morality is. But okay, I can already hear the sound of religious objection. Of course religious views vary, but that's not because my religion is only subjectively correct. It still has an objectively true morality. It's just that other people have gotten it wrong and follow a false morality because they feel that their religion is objectively true when it really isn't. My morality is still objective, even if other people have gotten it wrong.
Why do they feel that their moral system is objectively true? I feel like it's because it has this track record. It's like been around forever. People have been using it successfully for thousands of years. That probably gives them a hint.
Yeah, it's making an inference to it. But this also makes me think of all the different interpretations of quantum mechanics. I mean, you have Bohmian mechanics, you have the many worlds interpretation, you have the orthodox, you have quantum Bayism. Does that mean science is subjective?
Yeah.
Just because there's all these different views? I mean,
exactly.
I hear physicists going, I really do think Bohm-mean mechanics is the correct way we should understand the quantum world. And you have another physicist says, no, we should just use the standard Copenhagen interpretation and just go with that. Just because there's disagreement, that doesn't mean it's all subjective. Why would you use that principle in morality but not in science?
Yes, the underlying design principles are out there for us to discover.
But there are two problems with this. Firstly, the exact same could be said of atheistic claims to objective morality. Of course, atheistic morality varies by social and geographical backgrounds, but that doesn't mean it's not objective, just that other people have gotten it wrong. It's the same thing. But secondly, and more crucially, the only reason that anybody could possibly choose one religious morality as more ethically viable than another is because they feel it provides a better framework for moral truth. How else could a person possibly prove to themselves or to others that one religion has a superior ethical code to another? How else can a Christian possibly believe that the ethical code of Christianity is superior to that of Islam? If you want to compare the ethics of two religions, you need some moral basis on which to judge them. But that moral basis obviously can't be one of the religions, and so the only way that you can decide which religion is morally superior is through a subjective analysis of which you feel.
I mean, that's just wrong. I mean, it's like
we can measure the suicide rate, right? There's all kinds of things we can measure.
It's not all about feelings. It's it's the same. It's about what is going to produce the best society, what is going to produce be the best for humanity, what's going to align more with our moral intuitions, what's going to align more with the way ethics manifest within moral experience and moral progress. This is not whimsical picking here. It's based on it's not like taste preferences. I'm not just picking a morality based on what I feel I really like on the inside of my heart of hearts. It's clearly like vanilla or chocolate or something. It's people are actually going out and they're trying to really decipher these types of things and see what works best, what is actually going to produce the most virtues, or if you're a utilitarian, the most happiness, or what's going to conform most to theontic values. It's quite rigorous. And I don't even need to appeal to a Christian philosopher for this. I can just appeal to people like Ruth Schaefer-Landau or Thomas Nagel. Both are atheists and they're both moral realists.
You keep coming back to taste preferences, and I keep thinking taste preferences are even designed to guide us. Like there are tastes that you don't want because they guide you away from things that are bad. Like they're not, even taste preferences are not completely subjective, right? Like you don't want to taste you don't want to taste rancid meat for a reason, a very logical reason.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. I was just more referring to, I guess I'm more referring to like ice cream flavors.
No, I know. But there's a reason we don't make, there is a reason we don't make rancid meat ice cream, right?
Right. Did you know what George Washington's wife's favorite ice cream flavor was? It was squid.
No way.
They did squid ice cream back then. So just remember that. But that's objective. But we would say that's disgusting. And we shouldn't really make that.
Wow.
But we wouldn't, you and I, if someone was actually enjoying that flavor of ice cream, we wouldn't be like, oh, they should be brought to justice. They need to be stopped.
Totally.
There's clearly a difference. That's why morality, but see, notice how different morality manifests in reality. If someone is mutilating little girls in Africa,
right, we
want to stop that because that's objectively wrong. It's not like, oh, well, they just like squid ice cream. All right, it's weird, it's gross, but it's we don't need to stop it. To each his own.
But we know why it's objectively wrong, though. I mean, that kind of thing would be damaging to the moral community. Like a lot of things you can trace back to that. And squid ice cream is like, it's not my taste, definitely, but it's not going to kill you. Like rancid meat might actually kill you. So I'm only bringing it up because there's a wide variety of preferences around things that are healthy and good for us. Where we start drifting into, preference does not matter is when we're drifting into things that are actually harmful for us. And I think in the moral realm, we're treading there because we're talking about things that, like, when when you're talking about things like rape and murder, those things can destroy a society.
Right.
Yeah.
And we would say that's objectively wrong in of itself.
Right.
Feel is better. It's ultimately a subjective decision based on your, not your religion's, moral intuition. But still, and interestingly, something tells me that Dr. Craig wouldn't accuse, say, a Muslim of having subjective morality, even though he thinks that their morality is objectively false, since it contradicts.
That doesn't make sense, because there is no Islamic versus Christianity morality. It's Muslims would have an objective morality, probably non-natural moral realism. So would Christians. But we would just, the religious aspect is completely different than the metaethical status, and that's why I don't understand. I don't know what he's doing with this part. It just didn't make sense to me when I watched this.
There are different design features between Christianity and Islam. Like Islam tends to go harder on apostates, and I think that is not a good design feature. I mean, there's an argument that it's a good design feature in one environment and a bad design feature in another environment. And I would say that those environments are the modern world versus the ancient world.
Yeah, but that's applied ethics. That's not even normative ethics. That's more like applied ethics. Like how do we apply ethics? And you could apply it through a religion or through the specific principles. So that would be completely different if it's objective or subjective or not.
Right. But the applied versus the normative, just so I understand, you're saying, I'm struggling here because whether or not the right prescription is going to be determined somewhat by the environment, right?
Well, yeah, applied ethics is it's very practical.
Okay.
How can this actually operate in reality? You're really blurring into politics. Like, okay, if you think abortion is wrong, okay, how do we apply that? Do we just outlaw it all at once, or do we try to put laws to sort of roll it back slowly? So that's a little different in of itself.
Okay, interesting.
Christianity. The religious point the finger at atheism for having subjective morality, but not at other religions. Why not? What's the difference in a Christian's eyes between atheistic morality and Islamic morality? What makes one able to claim that their morality is objective, but the other not?
See, and this is what's, I hear you laughing over there. This is what's interesting, because what is atheist morality? What is the design principles around atheist morality? Because I feel like there's whatever atheist you ask, it's like asking just some rando to design an airplane. Like, what are your design principles about designing your aircraft?
Yeah, there's no such thing as atheistic morality. That doesn't even make sense. There's you could have secular morality might be a better term to use for that. But if you ever talk to any philosopher, it's an atheist. They're not going to be like atheistic morality. They'd be like, well, no, I'm a quasi-realist, or they're going to be like, or I'm a non-natural moral realist. They're not going to be like, there's no group of atheistic morality, moral philosophers out there trying to build an atheistic view of morality, because a lot of the atheist philosophers in ethics disagree about which view to take. Some agree with religious people, or I guess religious philosophers on non-natural moral realism. Some are cultural relativists. Some are non-cognitivists. There is no such thing as atheistic morality.
Right. Interesting.
Clearly, neither can actually be objectively true according to the Christian, because they both contradict Christianity. So the only difference is that the Muslim believes their morality to be objective, even though it isn't according to the Christian, whereas the atheist doesn't. And suddenly we're once again...
But you're saying you disagree with him just in the fact that you believe that the Muslims' morality is objective, just as you believe your morality is objective.
In terms of metaethical status, they could be a non-natural moral realist. They could say that our morality is objective.
Right.
I may disagree on how they ground it. I may disagree on how they apply it, but they could still claim they're moral realists.
Gotcha.
Again, in the realm of subjectivity. The only thing that seems to distinguish religious morality from atheistic morality, even according to the religious here, is that the religious believer feels like their morality is objective, whereas the atheist recognizes the subjectivity lying at the heart of ethical decision-making. The reason that Craig wouldn't accuse a Muslim of subjective morality is therefore not because their morality is objective, which he obviously doesn't believe, but because they feel that it's objective and treat it as though it's such. Think, one of Craig's objections to subjective morality is that he says that a person can't possibly live a happy life assuming that morality is subjective. But this shows that his criteria for a claim to objectivity is not actual objectivity, but simply the belief in objectivity and acting as though morality is objective even if it isn't. Therefore, we can see that the religious claim to objective moral values is ultimately based on two things: a subjective recognition of the superiority of a person's particular religion, and the feeling, rather than the fact, that the morality of that religion is objective, even if it actually isn't.
I mean, the problem is that no one would argue for moral realism that way. No one says morality is objective because my religion says so, unless you're a radical Christian fundamentalist. I mean, my entire series on ethics, I never invoke Christianity. I never have to bring up the Bible because I'm not. It's just no one does that. No Christian philosopher would ever, doesn't need to do that to argue for moral realism. So I don't understand where he's getting these arguments from. I would really like to know his source on this. Like, where is he getting the idea that you have to argue for religious morality, whatever that is, by appealing to your religion? Because Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig, Peter S. Williams, none of them do that.
Well, they're arguing a lot with fundamentalists, so perhaps that's just where they're getting their opinion from. So it's mostly like fundamentalists.
True, but I mean, like, he's doing it in such broad terms that it's just kind of bothering myself, someone who's read a lot of moral philosophy, that like this is not what the professionals say or come anywhere near. So if he was wording it more like, well, when I deal with Christian fundamentalists, they say this, I'd be like, okay, and I probably would never have looked at this video twice because he's not addressing, but he's trying to talk about, religious people in general terms. And I think that's not being charitable.
And I guess one of my problems is just from like an ethical naturalist perspective, he's not invoking any of like the natural features of the world. Like nowhere does empirical science come into his evaluation of the problem. So it's missing so much richness that the scientific community can deliver, that it's a little, I mean, it's just so dry.
I've got more. If you're not with me already, try this as a final nail. Let's forget everything I've just said about religious morality. Well, let's say that you agree with what I've said, but you just don't think that your religious morality is based on a subjective recognition of the moral superiority of your religion, but rather on the objective evidence that your God exists. This, I'm sure, will be a common rebuttal. You believe that your religious morality is true, not because you've judged it to be ethically superior, but because you think that the God of your religion has been proven to exist, or your religion proven to be otherwise factually accurate.
Yeah, I see you shaking your head over there.
I mean, that's just not that just doesn't, I mean, as I said earlier, how you ground morality is completely different, whether it's objective or subjective or not. And when I do I have two videos on the moral argument. One is the moral argument, and the second one is the second title is God the same as moral goodness? And nowhere do I say, well, nowhere do I use that type of argument. I simply just argue that the features of the good itself imply a personal, rational source in and of itself. So it just is I know he's not attacking me, but as a Christian myself, it almost feels like a straw man. So it's like no one argues for morality that way.
Yeah. Neither of us would.
So, okay, I'll grant you it. Let's say that somehow we were to objectively demonstrate...
And I don't... he doesn't really go anywhere with the moral intuitions either, because it's like, yeah, we have this... Like, everyone has different moral intuitions. I mean, we see this in politics all the time. This is why there's a debate over abortion. People have different moral intuitions. The question is, how are we going to come to an agreement on what is the right course of society based on those moral intuitions? We're really trying to factor in, and I hate it to come down to a utilitarian argument, but it always seems to come down to a utilitarian argument. The most good for the most number of people seems to be what works.
You know what's interesting about, like, for example, the abortion debate? It's not, I don't even know if it's even about moral intuitions. It's more about what, if they can define this as a person, because everyone in the abortion debate agrees it's wrong to kill a person. What people that are pro-choice would say, well, is this really a person yet? So then it wouldn't necessarily be wrong. So they almost have the same moral intuitions. It's just their facts about what would qualify as a human are different. So that's really where the debate is. It isn't even over moral intuitions. It's over surrounding circumstantial facts about how we ought to apply our moral intuitions.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to those the application of those moral intuitions. But I myself think that the intuitions generally come first, and then we work backwards to try to justify those moral intuitions.
Trait that a particular God, say the God of Christianity, exists. We know this for a fact. You might say that if this is the case, religious morality is objective, because if God is the author of everything, then it's he who determines what is good and what is bad, objectively. Clearly, if God exists and has objectively defined certain things as good and bad, we can objectively determine how we ought to behave. Morality is objective.
No, that would be subjective, because it's just whatever God defines to be that way.
Yeah, he's just a subject.
Yeah, if you turn God into a subject, which, Christian philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine spent a hell of a lot of time dealing with these issues in and of themselves, that God is not a subject like us. He is a being, but he is, beyond just this mere sort of like subject, like as humans are. So, it just seems almost like a straw man yet again. I mean, if you read the extensive work done by a lot of these, philosophers, even modern ones, like William Lane Craig or Richard Swinburne, they've dealt with these kind of things.
Do you? I think I asked you before. You don't watch a lot of Jordan Peterson, but you have watched some.
Yeah, I have watched some.
In the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson debate, Sam Harris pressed him about his definition of God, which is like a lot of people get really triggered over Jordan Peterson's definition of God, but Jordan Peterson is basically defining God as the design principles that I'm talking about. So if we can agree that there is a best case morality out there that's, the right way to behave that's going to benefit the most people, and that is a quantifiable, objective design that we're searching for, Jordan Peterson would basically say God is that design principle. He has a number of definitions of God, but that's one of them.
That's very similar to kind of how I argue via the moral argument. So you may want to check out my videos on that, because you might find something you agree in there. I just argue that it actually is a personal source. And so I argue the good actually is personal. It's I don't have time to get into it now, but you're getting kind of similar to what I've argued for.
Well, from a deistic perspective, you can totally agree with this. So if you're taking the moral argument from a deistic perspective, then I would likely agree. Just I wouldn't necessarily think that there is a God that is the author of the design principles, but I think these design principles are essential, and they're what make human beings magical. That's why we've taken over this rock. The ability for us to cooperate as a team is that's morality right there. The set of rules.
Right? Well, there's actually still a hidden assumption within this, and this is why earlier I was so stressing the importance of understanding morality in the two parts that I defined. Firstly, a recognition of good and bad, but also the idea that we ought to do what's good and not what's bad. So here's the single question that completely changed the way that I view religious morality. Why ought we do that which is good? I want you to really think about this, because it's crucial. Why ought we do that which is good?
See, this is a tough thing. Like, good for me or good for the group?
It's also one of the things. It's confusing something that Kant said, the difference between the categorical imperative and a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is something you do that's pragmatic. Like I eat because it keeps me alive. A categorical imperative is something that's irreducible. You don't kill because it's just simply wrong to commit murder. It's irreducible. You cannot reduce it to some sort of smaller pragmatic value. So in his reply, I would say he's confusing the categorical imperative with the hypothetical imperative. I don't need to give a reason. It's just simply wrong to do these things, or it's simply good to do these things in and of themselves. Like the analogy he gave earlier, yellow is just simply yellow. It doesn't reduce to smaller parts. Well, likewise, the categorical imperatives, they don't reduce to smaller pragmatic or smaller pragmatic values or pragmatic duties. They just simply are in and of themselves.
Are you saying each behavioral prescription is like a quanta? It's like it's its own thing?
I would say that each moral value or moral duty is irreducible.
Okay. Yeah. You're saying like thou shalt not kill is one moral value?
You could say it like that. It's one moral duty that you just can't reduce to any smaller parts. It's just wrong to kill because it's wrong to kill. Now there are pragmatic aspects for like the group in and of themselves, but we would but in terms of like a categorical imperative, it's just irreducible.
Right. Well, it's not always wrong to kill, though. I mean, obviously.
Oh yeah. I meant more like murder, like murder.
Okay.
Yeah. A better one would be rape. Rape, I would say, is always wrong.
If someone cuts you off on the freeway, then we're having a conversation. Then it might be okay to kill. No, don't do that. Don't cut. Just let it go. It'll make you feel better.
Let's say that good really was defined by God. We've said that we've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the God of Christianity really does exist, and really did write, for instance, the 10 Commandments, let's say. We can therefore objectively say that murder, adultery, bearing false witness, etc. are bad, objectively. That's not enough. You still need to demonstrate objectively that because something is good, we ought to do it, and because something is bad, we ought not do it. Of course, it seems stupidly obvious and absolutely instinctive that we ought to do what's good. Of course we ought to do what's good.
No, but I mean, you can't prove a lot of things. I mean, that's just not how it works. You can't prove that morality is subjective. You can't prove necessarily every scientific theory that we hold to is true. We just say it hasn't been falsified yet, and that it's most likely true.
Right.
Why would he expect proof, or you have to demonstrate it in this realm? That didn't make sense to me either, because he can't prove morality actually is subjective either. So he's not going to put the own standard on his own view that he's trying to put on the moral realist here.
It's like when you finally get to the design principles that deliver that fastest airplane, and there's no possible way that you can get any faster. You're still never going to know if you can't just get 10 more miles an hour out of this thing, right? You're never going to know. You're never going to know.
A quote I always use is by Richard Boyd. He says, "In the sciences, we decide between theories on the basis of observations, which have an important degree of objectivity. It appears that in moral reasoning, moral intuitions play the same role which observations do in science. We test general moral principles and moral theories by seeing how they or how their consequences conform or fail to conform to our moral intuitions about particular cases." So we can't prove things in the science, like with your example with the airplane. We can't prove things in ethics, but we still see what is the best explanation or what is going to operate the best.
Yeah, we can determine whether or not the results were pathetic or good or acceptable, and tinker around, make judgments accordingly. So it's just the thing that I think people find dangerous about this kind of moral subjectivism is that you're kind of throwing the idea that you can make incremental improvements out the window, like if everything's all of a sudden subjective.
Mm-hmm.
But can you prove it? Just because it's instinctive doesn't mean it's true. Let's not forget the basic premise of skepticism, which is to take nothing for granted. The idea that we ought to do that which is good is a subjective impulse that cannot be demonstrated to be objectively true, even if good can be. And so even if God really did exist, and even if he really did define good and bad, there's still no way to objectively determine how we ought to behave. It's still reliant on subjectivity. Now, the religious might respond that of course we can prove that we ought to do that which is good, because God commands us to do that which is good. God defines good.
It's so great to see you just shaking your head over there. You're just like,
I mean, well,
wrong.
that's not the argument.
Good, and God
It's such a huge straw man. You, in your debate with him, you guys were like tiptoeing around a lot of the ideas that I'm bringing to the table here. But I just wish Cosmic Skeptic would be like, he's representing my side of the debate. Like, don't straw man.
Yeah.
commands us to do that which is good, and so morality is objective. But you've got two problems. Firstly, you just push the issue back. I can still ask why I ought to do what God commands, and any answer you give me can just be questioned in the same way. We ought to do what God commands because God is good, so why ought I do that which is good? Because God commands it? You've got yourself a circle. But secondly, consider that a command contains no truth value. If I say, go and follow me on Twitter, is that true or false? It's neither, because a command can't be true or false, it just is. So even
Isn't the moral argument though really that if this kind of behavior will produce better results? I mean, the reason why we make murder illegal is because we think society will fall apart if everyone's running around killing each other over tiny disputes, right?
Yeah. It's not beneficial. It's not beneficial to humans.
So it's
in that terms.
It's an if then. Yeah.
Yeah, but he's also talking about, like, obviously prescriptions are not true or false. I mean, no one claims that either. It's true that you ought to follow the commands, of the moral law. It's true you ought to do the good. It's true you ought to value things that are good. So I don't understand this point with here. I think it almost seems, I'm not sure if this is the right term for it, but it almost seems like a category error. No one's claiming that commands are true or false. We're saying it's true you ought to follow command X.
Right.
Even if God commands us to do that which is good, that commandment can't be objectively true. Whether it's a command we should follow or not is simply based on whether or not we recognize God's authority. Now, of course, God commands that we recognize his authority, or you might argue that we know that God's authority is good. But you can't prove that we should follow his command to recognize his authority, and you can't prove that because his authority is good, we ought to recognize it. It's still ultimately a subjective instinct that we ought to do that which is good, and even if it weren't, it would be based on circular logic and so invalid. Thus, if it means anything, religious morality is subjective. Now, don't get me wrong here. I am, like I say, a moral subjectivist myself, and so, of course, I don't think there's anything wrong with constructing a moral framework based in subjectivity, as I'm claiming the religious do, as long as the framework is recognized as such. All I'm saying is that whilst religious morality claims to be objective, it is in fact ultimately subjective, and so needs to stop presumptuously claiming the sole right to proper...
It's just like it's bouncing around from like metaethics to grounding, moral ontology. It's like it's hard to follow because I really think he's conflating objective with how something is grounded, and I think that's one of the main problems with this video. As I've said before, you can ground something and still be grounded in something that's subjective. For example, you could ground something in. There's actually a view called ideal observers. You ground morality in ideal observers in society, but that's still grounding them in a subjective view. So, it seems like he's getting confused on that.
So, grounding something subjective, if we're using the definition that grounding is just what gives it its authority, would that be kind of like saying, because some famous celebrity says vanilla ice cream is the best, then vanilla ice cream is the best. We're grounding it in the authority of that person's perspective, but it's still something ultimately subjective. Yeah.
So how you ground something, if you ground morality in God, that doesn't necessarily mean it's objective.
Right.
So, it just seems like this is one of the biggest problems with this video, is it confusing metaethics with moral ontology.
Well, and a lot of these conversations, I just see revolving around the definition of objective as well. Like you're like a lot of times people think objective is not changing over time, but objective things can change over time. Come on.
Well, I mean, yeah, this is one thing I've talked about is like circumstances can change the moral status of something. Like you could say it's wrong for me to murder Joe, but if Joe has a gun to
Yeah,
what
exactly.
I should probably murder, because that would be the objective thing to do. I think it was Thomas Nagel that used this analogy, like think of it as like almost like you're on a road and you need to know the fastest way to get to the post office. There's an objective way that is the fastest way to get to the post office. Now, if that can change based on circumstances. What if there is a traffic light out? What if there's an accident? What if certain circumstances can change what is the objective fastest way to get to the post office?
Right. And if morality is a strategy that a group of people adopts, once that strategy is either successful or a failure, that success or failure is objective.
Or grounded ethics. So that's my coverage of religious morality.
So do you want to just move on from there at that point, or do you want to go to Q&A? Because we kind of got to the end of the video at this point.
Yeah, I think so.
However, and of course, it's not just the religious who I think claim their morality is objective when it really isn't. There are many people who are atheists and still believe that morality can be objective, with the most famous atheistic case for this probably being Sam Harris's in The Moral Landscape, or at least...
Have you read Moral Landscape?
I think a long time. I don't think I finished it.
Yeah, it's pretty dry.
Well, it's also, I'd rather read professional philosophers on this because, Harris's view of morality is just one form of ethical naturalism, and it's not even a really good one. I mean, it suffers from a lot of problems. But I mean, like, you could be a non-natural moral realist and still be an atheist. It's not like all atheistic morality, whatever that is, has to be some form of ethical naturalism.
Right. If you guys have any questions for me or Michael, you can @ me in the chat. I'm just going to play just till we have the outro.
I want to dismantle Harris's case for objective morality and show why I think it's still ultimately subjective, but also explain why I don't think this has to be such a tragedy and how we can still make ethical decisions as though they're based in objectivity, even when they're not. It should be interesting, but until then, I hope you've enjoyed this so far.
So any closing thoughts? I have one super chat, but it's not actually question related because it's Ajar.
Oh, what is it?
It's Ajar making fun of me. He wants your feedback on whether or not I'm a secret Christian. Let me see if I can.
Oh, if you're in the closet?
That's so,
I think you're in the closet.
That's so funny. Oh my God, he's coming. Hey, Michael, is Adam a closet Christian? Some anti-theists think so. I think they claim it so they can dismiss ideas that are scary to them. Well, I agree with you, Ajar, but...
I think Adam is in the closet.
There's
period. There's nothing else to say there. In the closet.
That's hilarious. Totally. Don't tell my wife I'm in the closet, okay? She'll be very upset about this. So many of the I just want people to put their best argument forward. So I believe that a lot of people are Christians because they have a feeling of the divine. They have some experience that makes them a believer, and I haven't had that experience. So
I've not had any experiences either, so that would be different for me probably. No, I've not really had any, like, I don't know. My wife says my personality is very similar to Ron Swanson, so I just don't get very emotional.
Ron Swanson, isn't that a character on like Saturday Night Live or something?
No, it's Parks and Recs.
Oh yes, yeah, there we go. That's what it is. I love that show. Are you a hardcore libertarian? Do you want to privatize the police department?
I'm not talking about my political views on air because I don't want to upset people, but I don't leave that.
That's funny. So you heard it here first. He does want to privatize the police department. He just doesn't want to tell you. So Mad Robot says, how can morality be objective from an atheist perspective if atheists believe we have no purpose, no meaning in life? Well, I do believe we have a purpose. I think it's an evolutionary purpose, and I think nature has tuned us to find meaning in a lot of different ways. If you know my channel, you know my outro is Jordan Peterson talking about how we find meaning through suffering, which if we only as a species found meaning through pleasure, then we wouldn't enjoy tough things like establishing a base on Mars. Like, that's going to be totally kick ass. And the reason we have people willing to do it is because people like a challenge, and that those challenges often involve suffering, which gives meaning to our lives, moving us forward. I think even trying to find the optimal way of doing things is a quest that we're all on. So Sunbro says, Think Club, isn't claiming morality is subjective an objective claim? Go ahead.
To answer that, I would say not necessarily, because you're making a logical claim there, that you're making an objectively logical claim that morality, this area of morality, is subjective in there. So it's one thing if you would say, there are no absolute truths, because you're making a subjective claim about logic itself. But if you're talking about morality itself, you could say objectively, from a logical standpoint, it is subjective. So not in that, I would not say that necessarily follows now.
PSA Sitch, the ultimate troll, says Michael keeps saying that if God exists and created the universe, that God's rules would still God's rules would still be subjective and not objective. I don't understand how that makes any sense.
I was using that as an example. I mentioned earlier, like, let's say there was an open theist God who's like subject to space-time. That doesn't necessarily mean that God is some sort of there would be some sort of subjective form of morality, which is sort of following what our creator tells us to do. So I was just using it as an example. I don't actually think that.
Okay.
Because if you see my videos on the moral argument, I argue that this very much is grounded in a necessary, rational, personal source, and that's my view of moral ontology. And so, check out my videos, the moral argument and is God the same as moral goodness? I do it in 2 videos, and I sort of explained it in detail there.
So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying, just for the example's sake, you're saying that if God has a set of opinions about how we should do things, those from our perspective, we can say God's opinion on this, we know his opinion, and therefore that's objective. It would be the equivalent of the celebrity thing. We know so-and-so celebrity's favorite ice cream is vanilla because they've told us. That's an objective fact.
Yeah, I wouldn't really use the word opinions, because that denotes subjectivity in and of itself.
Right, but it is subjective because it's from their perspective. Like, from the celebrity's perspective, their subjective opinion is vanilla is the best ice cream in the world.
Yeah.
But from
from the person's perspective, yeah.
Right. That's what you're saying.
But we wouldn't say that. Yeah, we wouldn't say God. For example, the God I believe in is not like a subject like that. It is far beyond just simply, subjects like ourselves. So it's a little bit more complicated, and that's why I detail it in the videos.
And from my perspective, it's basically the Jordan Peterson perspective, that God is just the design principles. So it looks like that's all the questions. We're coming up on 2 hours here, so I feel like I should let you go. Do you have any closing thoughts on this? This has been a fascinating discussion, and I encourage everyone who watches it after the fact to leave us some comments and some feedback. If so many of my commenters are teaching me things along the way, so it's a fascinating dialogue.
I'll give some book recommendations. This is the one I keep referencing, Minding Cosmos by Thomas Nagel.
Okay.
Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Certainly False is the subtitle. If you want to know more about ethical naturalism, don't read Sam Harris's book. This is probably a better book by Kevin DeLapp, Moral Realism, and he's an ethical naturalist. If you want to know the different views of morality, this is a good book here, Metaethics by Andrew Fisher. The view I mostly take on metaethics, this is another atheist philosopher. Ruche Furlando, Moral Realism, a Defense, and he defends non-natural moral realism. So I gave you Ethical Naturalist View, Non-Natural Moral Realist View, and some other books as well. Those are books I would recommend to people if you want to really study this more.
Yeah, and the books from a secular perspective that really have influenced me on this whole objective morality and moral systems is probably, I mean, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt is really a game changer as far as he tries to put together a empirical system to understand moral intuitions. Like, he's basically categorizing our moral intuitions, how they evolved, how they affect our politics, how they affect our religiosity, that kind of thing. That's a fascinating book if anyone wants to check it out. Also, once you get past the how we all come together to form these different moral communities, you start thinking about, well, how do we compare these moral communities between one another? And the books that I use, that I constantly go back to, are Why Nations Fail, because really nations are kind of a moral community. They have a set of laws, which are a set of rights and wrongs, oughts and ought nots. And some of those nations are horrible places to live, and some of those nations are great places to live. So Why Nations Fail is a great book. And also The Dictator's Handbook by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alistair Smith is another great book that kind of gets at the moral, how our structuring of groups kind of affects how our institutions are formed and developed. So those are fascinating books to read. Looks like we've given them this is enough reading to last, I think, probably. Like, you guys got about a year of reading ahead of you. So
I'd say about a month.
Yeah. Yeah, nice. Nice. He's a quick reader. I will definitely check out your recommendations as long as they're on Audible, because I
should be, yeah.
I never really have time to sit down and read, but I paint a lot, and when I paint, I always put on an audiobook. So
I think some of them are, yeah. I don't know. I don't do a lot of audiobooks.
So do you have anything you want to plug before I end the stream?
I'm just going to be continuing my series on Genesis for the rest of the year. My next video will be on the serpent and why it was probably a divine being in Genesis 3, not a literal talking snake. So I'll be going over the early Hebraic evidence for that. In the winter, I mentioned some of the research I'm doing for the winter, like I mentioned Jean Bottero, so I'm going to be talking about the anomalies in the biblical texts and some of the interesting things with regards to that. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Cool. I have that interview with Justin Brierley. He's the host of Unbelievably, has a new series coming out, The Big Conversation, and I'll probably have that interview up by the end of the week. So, and obviously I'm doing debates every Wednesday. Michael will probably be debating sometime in the future once he has some free time. He's trying to catch up on his videos. So, but I'll go ahead and leave it there. Thanks for joining in, Michael. Thanks for your super chat. Thanks for everyone's participation in the chat, and we will catch you in the next video.